She was 73 when the sentence slipped from her lips, quiet, steady, and heavy enough to still the air around her. Lesley Manville sat near the window that afternoon, the late light casting a muted amber glow across her face, softening the sharp lines carved by decades of discipline, triumph, and silence. Outside, London moved as it always did, hurried, indifferent, unaware. Inside, however, time seemed to slow, as if waiting for her to speak again. "I have never forgiven 5 people," she murmured. "Not then. Not now." There was no bitterness in her voice, no tremor of rage, only a calmness so deep it felt like something learned, not inherited. A woman celebrated for her elegance, her precision, her strength on screen, yet behind the camera she had carried shadows that even fame could not dissolve. 5 faces, 5 moments, 5 quiet fractures that shaped the way she walked through the world. She looked at her hands for a long moment, as though the story of her life was written between the veins. Years of applause, years of restraint, years of unspoken disappointments. And now at 73, she finally allowed one truth to rise to the surface. 5 people she could not forgive, not even today. But who were they? Before the applause, before the costumes, and the carefully sculpted characters, there was a young girl in a small Hertfordshire home who learned early that silence could be both a refuge and a prison. Lesley Manville was born in 1956 in a family that valued discipline more than affection, steadiness more than confession. The radio was often the loudest voice in the house. The rest of them spoke softly, as if afraid their words might break something fragile in the air. She grew up watching her mother mend dresses late into the night, the glow of a single lamp stretching shadows across the living room walls. Her father, a tradesman with a firm sense of order, believed emotions should be folded neatly and tucked away, like linens kept for special occasions. Lesley absorbed this without protest. She learned to smile without showing the tremble underneath, learned that disappointment should be swallowed, not shared. Yet even as a child, she sensed the quiet fault lines inside her family. The arguments paused but not resolved, the resentments buried but never healed. Those early tensions shaped her more deeply than anyone suspected. They taught her that trust was delicate, and once broken, could rarely return to its original form. In those years, she began to retreat into imagination, creating characters, inventing stories, giving voice to the emotions she could not speak aloud. Acting became a shelter, a place where she was finally allowed to feel without consequence. But long before the stage found her, the first wounds had already formed, and they would follow her for a lifetime. The years that followed moved quickly, as if the world had suddenly decided to spin faster, just to see whether she could keep up. Lesley was barely a teenager when she entered the stage schools that would change the trajectory of her life. For the first time, she found a place where her quiet intensity was not only accepted, but admired. Her voice, low, precise, almost fragile, became a tool. Her restraint, something she once considered a flaw, transformed into a rare elegance directors fought to capture. By her early 20s, the stage lights became the architecture of her days. She stepped into roles that required depth beyond her years, women wrestling with longing, betrayal, or moral ambiguity. The critics took notice. Producers called. The world she had once watched from the narrow window of her childhood home now unfolded beneath her feet, wide and bright. But along with success came a different kind of solitude. Fame had its own silence, sharper, brighter, more demanding. Behind every curtain call was a dressing room filled with stillness, the kind that reminded her of the nights when her mother stitched dresses under the dim lamp. She smiled for photographs, offered polished answers in interviews, yet something inside her remained quietly guarded. In the 1980s and 1990s, as her film and theater work blossomed, she began to encounter the first fine cracks in her world. Not dramatic, not explosive, just subtle shifts. A collaborator who took credit for more than his share. A friend who disappeared the moment her life became complicated. Small betrayals at first, faint warnings that trust remained a dangerous territory. Still, the momentum of her career carried her forward. She won roles that demanded everything: emotional transparency, vulnerability, courage. Yet the more she revealed on screen, the more she concealed off it. Success did not soften her. It hardened her resolve, sharpened her instincts. She could portray heartbreak flawlessly, but she rarely allowed anyone close enough to witness her own. Despite the acclaim, despite the applause, there were nights when she sensed the early wounds resurfacing, reminding her that the past does not vanish, it only sleeps. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shadows began gathering behind her. Shadows that carried names. Names she would one day refuse to forgive. Success had a way of illuminating everything, both the triumphs and the fractures. And for Lesley Manville, the first real rupture did not arrive with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet, almost polite cruelty. It was the kind of betrayal that wears a calm face, the kind that steals trust without raising its voice. It happened during a period when her career was flourishing and her private life felt, for the first time, almost steady. She believed she had found someone she could lean on, someone who understood the weight of a life lived in public. But promises made in warm rooms often dissolve in colder seasons. Words once spoken with conviction slowly turned vague. Affection thinned, stretched, and finally snapped in two. The ending was neither loud nor cinematic. It arrived in an unfinished sentence, in a door gently closing, in the unmistakable realization that she had been left to carry the burden alone. That day, something inside her shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. She began to understand that sincerity could be selective, and loyalty could evaporate in silence. Colleagues noticed a subtle change in her. She became more guarded, more precise, choosing her connections with a sharper instinct. She had learned that not every smile was genuine, not every partnership built to endure. And in the quiet that followed, she felt the first true name settle into her memory. A name she could not erase, a wound she could not soften. Since then, she carried the fragments of that moment like a stone in her pocket, a reminder that betrayal rarely announces itself. It simply arrives. 5 names, 5 wounds, 5 shadows that never left her, no matter how brightly the spotlight burned around her. When Lesley Manville finally spoke about them at 73, she did not speak with bitterness, but with a clarity sharpened by decades of silence. Each name, she said, had shaped her, not through love, but through the quiet fractures they left behind. The first was gentle, almost tender in its pain. He had been a friend from her early theater years, someone she relied on in moments when the world of performance felt too large, too demanding. He was the one who told her she had something rare, something worth fighting for. Yet when her career began rising, he slipped away, not out of malice, but envy. His distance was polite, wrapped in excuses, but unmistakable. She never hated him for it. She simply never forgot how softly betrayal can arrive. His name rests in her memory like a faded photograph. Important once, painful still, forgiven by intention, but never fully released. The second name carried more weight, arriving at a time when she believed she had already learned the rules of trust. It was a collaborator, a director she admired, who publicly praised her, privately undermined her, and eventually claimed creative choices that were hers alone. She had worked tirelessly on a role, shaping its emotional terrain with instinct and precision, only to watch him take the credit unabashedly. The betrayal was sudden, unexpected, and painfully illuminating. It taught her that admiration can be a mask, and that some people hide ambition behind compliments. She never confronted him, never demanded acknowledgement, but his name sits like a cracked mirror in her memory, sharp at the edges, reflecting a version of herself she no longer allows to be diminished. The third name was the deepest wound of all. It belonged to someone she had loved, truly, vulnerably, without the armor she usually carried. He entered her life during a period of quiet strength, when she believed she had finally found a partnership built on sincerity. For a time, it felt like healing. But love, she discovered, can fracture more violently than anything else. His departure was not just abandonment, it was erasure. He rewrote the story of their years together, rewriting her as an inconvenience rather than a companion. She tried to forget, tried to rebuild, but the emotional scar remained, delicate, permanent. She does not speak his name anymore, not out of hatred, but because uttering it feels like reopening a wound that never fully closed. He is the one she speaks of least, yet the one she remembers most sharply. The silence around him is her monument. The fourth name belonged not to one person, but to an entire system. An industry that applauded her brilliance, yet doubted her resilience. There were years when she was scrutinized, dismissed, underestimated, or reduced to the margins of narratives she deserved to lead. She faced criticism harsher than her male counterparts, questions about her worth, her age, her relevance. Though she weathered it with grace, she never forgot the moments when the public gaze felt like judgment rather than appreciation. She forgave individuals, but not the machine that made her feel invisible at times. This fourth person was the world that cheered for her success, but also shaped her disappointment. In her heart, it stands as a collective betrayal, subtle, structural, enduring. And then, the fifth. The fifth, she whispered, is the hardest one. Because the final name, the name she has never forgiven, not even today, is her own. She has not forgiven the moments when she stayed silent instead of speaking, when she doubted her worth, when she allowed herself to shrink so others could shine. She has not forgiven the years she carried wounds without allowing them to heal, nor the choices she made out of fear instead of faith. It is easier, she said, to forgive those who hurt you than to forgive yourself for letting them. And so the fifth name remains the heaviest, the one she still wrestles with in the dim light of late afternoons. Not a face from her past, but the reflection in the mirror. When the evening quiet finally settled around her, Lesley Manville leaned back in her chair, letting the last traces of daylight fade across the room. The amber glow slipped into gray, softening the lines of her face, leaving only the calm presence of a woman who had lived, endured, and understood the weight of her own silence. In front of her lay a small notebook, its pages worn, its spine fragile, where she had once written fragments of roles, memories, and the questions she never dared to ask aloud. She touched the cover gently, as if it were an old companion. The 5 names remained with her, not out of vengeance, but because they had shaped her into someone who finally knew how to stand without fear. She no longer ran from the shadows. She simply acknowledged them, letting them rest where they belonged. Outside, the city hummed softly. Inside, she breathed with a steadiness that came only from years of learning how to carry both pain and grace in equal measure. Forgiveness was never the goal. Understanding was. Acceptance, perhaps, was the closest she could come. And as the room dimmed completely, 2 questions lingered in the air, quiet, unresolved, meant for anyone who has ever held a wound too long. Can a life truly move forward without forgiveness? Or do we sometimes need the ache, simply to remember we once loved?